Are humans obsessed with war? To see what I mean, just look up the list of the 100 highest grossing films of all time. At least 57 of them are about war or a violent conflict of some kind. And I'm probably undercounting them since I haven't seen all the movies on that list. I also didn't count Minions in there, although I probably should have. Anyway, the top 3 highest grossing movies themselves are exclusively about war, with massive battles in the climax, and the word war itself reappears more than any other word when you look at these titles on the list. Star Wars, Infinity War, Wolf Warrior, Captain America, Civil War, etc. The number of such films jumps considerably when you count the movies on the list that aren't explicitly about physical war or violent struggle, but still feature war as an abstract theme and have weapons and combat appear in the key moments of tension in the story, like the Jurassic Park films where it's about man versus nature, or Titanic where that one guy shoots at Leo DiCaprio because he shot into his fiancée, or even Zootopia that explores race war with its moments of violence and ethnic conflict. And when you include innocent children's movies about personal relationships, like Frozen and Aladdin, but where violence and combat is still featured in order to spice things up with the antagonist and make it exciting, even if it wasn't entirely necessary for the story, like in the case of Frozen. Then the number of movies with violent narratives jumps to around 91, out of 100. Completely innocent movies like Inside Out 1 and 2, where it's just about a little girl growing up and dealing with her emotions and where no one tries to kill her, not even once, are extremely rare exceptions among our most celebrated films. Which is ironic, because growing up is way more of a universal experience, while facing attempted homicide is not, hopefully. Unless you went to an American school, then I guess the two experiences are intertwined. But jokes aside, this isn't an American thing. The obsession with violence and war is present in all cultures alive today. The ones without it are no longer around for obvious reasons. They were quite literally devoured by warrior cultures in some cases. Look, my point is we humans make violence and conflict into a spectacle. We expect to see a character trying to unalive another one, even in our children's films. And when we're not watching movies about it, we are massacring the fictional bastards ourselves in our video games. And of course, books are no better. You can't even read about a love story without the chick shanking herself at the end because of warring families. The only entertainment medium not utterly fascinated or driven by violent conflict that comes to mind is probably music, where people just scream about broken hearts all the time.
Unless you're a Chad Sabaton enjoyer.
But even sports revolves around war, since anthropologically speaking, sports evolved as a way for boys to practice their battle skills, except for maybe golf, but golf sucks. And even beyond entertainment or media, war is present as an all-consuming concept. It's a prism through which we try understanding and dealing with issues. We make a war on drugs or poverty. When there's a pandemic, we see it as a war against the virus. And even when just trying to be a better person, we see it as a spiritual war against our inner demons. As every religion uses war as a metaphor for our struggle against vices of lust, or ignorance, or even our own violent tendencies, ironically enough. I decided to make this video because this is a question I've been forced to contend with in my personal life. Some of you, who have followed the channel for a while, may have noticed that I've been gone for a bit. Shout out to my friend Mr. Bird for filling in for me. The reason for my absence is because I discovered that I'm actually the son of Odin after taking shrooms, and Odin told me to start an NFT crypto coin that you can buy called Special Crypto Awesome Money, or SCAM for short, because I need the cash for my gender transition into a 40k orc and express my true self in the WAH after Trump cut off my USAID money. Therefore, finally completing every conceivable YouTuber meltdown character arc that everyone keeps expecting me to have any day now, the longer I work for this blasted website. That's why you should like and subscribe if you don't want to miss it. But in all seriousness, I was just traveling and volunteering in Ukraine again. This time, my trip was a little more intense than the last time I was there, and this video is a way for me to work some things out, some things that I witnessed over there. Analyzing war from a storytelling and cultural narrative perspective can be deeply uncomfortable, since war is a very real phenomenon that ruins countless lives, and comparing it to Hollywood fiction and video game franchises can sometimes feel in bad taste. But I think it's necessary nonetheless, since stories and narratives are a key aspect to any war. In my experience with military dudes, the biggest misconception about the soldier is that he is an undereducated, ignorant, or uncultured brute. Just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns in foreign policy, as Henry Kissinger once said, which implies that he is an unimaginative automaton conditioned to follow simple orders. And the most tragic thing about this vicious and erroneous stereotype is that it's partly believed by many soldiers themselves. What, I guess you can call it internalized anti-soldierism. This is true at least for many of the soldiers I met fighting in Ukraine, where they occasionally expressed an inferiority complex for not having an extensive education. But in reality, they were intellectually impressive. For one thing, they were extremely well informed on general knowledge, from encyclopedic understanding of human history to the importance of ingesting magnesium for cramps or potassium in bananas, the chemical reactions that happens inside grenades, the physics behind light refraction in the atmosphere, or how the compass needle works in relation to the magnetic poles, as well as general medical knowledge, of course. They have to know this stuff to be effective in what they do. But what was most impressive to me is that some of them could be great orators or masters of rhetoric, as they made great speeches that got the blood pumping. In reality, the good soldier is actually an extremely curious, intellectually active individual always trying to improve himself, and as a result, his imagination is constantly active and in need to be satiated. In short, the soldier is not a dumb jock archetype, but an extremely angry and homicidal nerd, regardless of education level. Soldiers are extremely nerdy from what I've seen, and many describe themselves as such, watching anime in the barracks, sharing Crunchyroll subscriptions, listening to Sabaton history music, or hunting for the Warhammer 40k themed pub all night while on leave in the big city. This is true regardless of age. Even older soldiers who grew up before nerd culture became cool literally founded a spec ops group in the Ukrainian army called Team Jedi, and their headquarters was called the Jedi Temple. I'm serious, I'm not making this up. And those guys are no joke, by the way, they're special forces. This is because our fiction is often inspired by real war as a visceral historical experience which permeates the culture. Future soldiers then grow up on fiction inspired by these events and have it as their reference for courage in the face of death, heroism, and service. Anthropologically speaking, this act of myth-making has a similar purpose to sports. But where sports simulate war physically in the form of games to prepare the body, our myths and stories simulate war to prepare us psychologically, instilling these higher concepts. And it's in that silly and geeky spirit that I offer this tribute to our fellow nerds in the armed forces.
This song goes out to men of war, of myth and blood and tales of yore. We sing the stories carved in more, the legends born in days before. From halls of Montezuma to Tripoli shore, 200 against 10,000 guarding the holy door. Knights who watch the pilgrims tread the ancient sacred land. Templars, lepers, hospitallers marched across the sand. So steel your heart and sheath your blade, say your prayers and be not afraid. Face the horde, be not dismayed, the ancient sacred land. The dream of Rome still whispers home when you flip through tales and dusty tomes to Minas Tirith's shining hall, while watchmen guard the icy wall and leper climbs to his great fall. History repeats the stories beat. A tyrant fears the hanging tree, and Templars soar through cosmic stars to crusade in eternal wars. The east and west with fire collide in stories that explore genocide. As Aaron weeps and Azula lies, Zuko turns and Gabi tries. Let's not forget women of wars. Some were great and some were whores. They need no males, or so they say, but for such tale no one will pay. Don't get me wrong, I love a song of noble ladies who are strong, but do it right under the light, to honor maidens who join the fight. The wars we fight take many forms, in faith and stars or desert storms. The Jedi rise, the Sith return, the Force divides, ideals burn. They call it madness, still they fight. One creed wrong, the other right. Modern minds claim this is insane, but are just as ruthless in their reign. For politics politics, they burn with zeal, and crimes commit for what they feel. They preach of peace, but power reigns, and burn the world to stake their claim. For politics or pride or pain, the war begins and stays the same. Equality turns into rage, ideals clash on history's stage. In neon streets where rich meet poor, the rebels knock on power's door. Cyberpunks and shadow fight to shatter lies and seek the light. A nation falls from pride to shame as Aaron dies for Elgin's name. What fools are we to shed our blood for skin or state on ancient mud? In trenches deep the silence loud, while heroes sleep beneath the shroud. The state drinks blood, it wants its due, but peace belongs to those who choose. This song goes out to men of war, with noble hearts and fractured cores. Yet war itself is cursed in vain, it leaves behind a trail of pain. It rises from our darkest fears, our weakness, hate, the unshed tears. But if you yield and let it be, then war will claim your family.
So why do we keep writing stories about war? Well, for one thing, war is so ubiquitous in storytelling because conflict is the driving force in any narrative, and war is conflict in its purest form. The narrative basically writes itself with a protagonist and antagonist and the fight between them, which typically ends with the victory of one side over the other. It's an easy template. And even when war is not the focus of the story, it's a fantastic source of conflict and narrative tension when it happens in the background of a story, which is typical in romance stories like Gone with the Wind, Romeo and Juliet, Twilight, and Gravity Falls.
Finally, we're together! I'm sorry, Mabel, but I have to go fight in the war!
Add this with the frequent appearance of war throughout history and its effects on culture, and we see that it formed a pattern in storytelling now called the hero's journey, popularized by Joseph Campbell. When you think about it, the hero's journey is just humans mythologizing about going to war. There's a call to adventure for a young man. He might refuse the call, but circumstances typically force him to go. He learns under an old mentor who trains him. He faces immense hardships, sees death, and then goes back home when the war is over. How many young men have lived through this exact experience throughout the ages? But even so, these explanations aren't enough to explain why war is so fundamental in human stories, political campaigns, and religions. War in the heavenly sphere often being the backdrop to life on Earth. The gods versus the titans, Lucifer being defeated by St. Michael, etc. After all, war is not the only human social phenomenon that could be used to spark stories. Plenty of life experiences are great sources of good storytelling. Finding love, tournament competitions, going to school, financial troubles, or grand political debates are all great sources of narrative tension and conflict. And though many great stories have emerged about these things, none of them are comparable to war in its sheer omnipresence in our cultural narratives, since most of them are just side plots within war stories anyway. And I think it's because war is a great metaphor for what goes on in the very fabric of the human mind. Take dialectics, for example. For those who might not know, dialectics is the act of finding the truth by comparing two opposing points of view and trying to see which one is more accurate. In other words, pitting two perspectives against each other. And the nature of logic is such where binaries are often necessary and two contradicting ideas cannot coexist. Not in a rational outlook. It's called the laws of thought. And by thought, I mean, ideas in your head, not some bimbo standing over there. Anyway, there's three main laws of thought, which are, number 1, the law of identity, which says that something is what it is and is not what it is not. Number 2, the law of excluded middle, which says that something is either true or false and cannot be both. You cannot unite the two states in a middle state. Number 3, the law of non-contradiction, which says that two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time, or in the same way. In short, they cannot coexist. When you analyze these three laws of thought, it becomes obvious where war comes from, right? This is the source of war in the material world. Because war is all about identity, and two sets of ideas not being able to coexist as one when put into action. Which is why people blaming religion as the source of war are wrong. The source of conflict is in reason and logic itself, because ideas and thought manifest as action in the material world. What your identity is and what your values are is what determines the existence of war. Identity being the key factor in any war throughout history, but especially these days as we see with Ukraine and Taiwan, as well as how should we organize society is also a massive cause of war. They cannot be organized according to two opposing points of view. Now, it's true that the laws of thought are a set of axioms, and axioms are beliefs that you can't prove and must be accepted as they are in order to start thinking. Kind of like articles of faith in a religion, which shows how faith is the beginning of logic and reason. Even reason has its dogmas. But at the same time, you cannot deny these axioms of 3 laws of logic without following them in the first place, which means they are inescapable. They are what I call the perpetual paradigm. If you try to escape it with the idea of tolerance, you enter a paradox, explained by Karl Popper, where if you tolerate the intolerant, then intolerance manifests. But if you're intolerant against those who are intolerant in the name of tolerance, then intolerance still exists, and you are still intolerant.
Here, intolerance will not be tolerated.
If you try to escape it with the idea of equality where we're all equal, man, so let's stop fighting, then those who are anti-egalitarian are inferior to egalitarians, and they need to accept the superior moral value of equality, or they become victims of our glorious revolution. If you try to escape it with the idea that you can't impose your ideas on others, that itself becomes an idea you try to impose. And if you try to escape it with moral relativism, so that all ideas are valid and can coexist, then you're saying that it's objectively wrong to believe that another person's idea is objectively wrong. You're still not able to make different perspectives coexist. You see, you can't escape the perpetual paradigm, where one idea is better than another and cannot coexist with the opposing idea, and therefore you can't organize a society that is not willing to enforce it, at least not one who would defend itself. How are you going to ban war without going to war with those who would practice war? Banning war is therefore unenforceable unless you are willing to use force. These 3 laws of logic that govern thought also govern how ideas interact in dialectics. And fiction is a great place to explore dialectics in narrative, from where ideas are personified into the characters we know and love. Them going to war is just a natural metaphor and visualization of the logical process, where 2 opposing ideas cannot coexist, so one must defeat the other. In Star Wars, the Empire versus the Rebels represents the exploration of tyranny versus freedom. In Avatar by James Cameron, humans are rampant industrial capitalism, and the Na'vi represent environmentalism. In Harry Potter, the Death Eaters versus the Order of the Phoenix represents supremacist ideals versus liberal values. In the first season of Legend of Korra, Amon is radical egalitarianism, and Korra is traditional hierarchy. That's why it's the best season. In Avengers Infinity War, Thanos is Malthusian theory, and the Avengers are just common sense. Now, these stories are more complex than just quick descriptions, and they often have more than just one ideas in conflict. Harry and Voldemort, for example, also represent the selfless sacrifice of one's life versus selfish fear of death and the pursuit of immortality at the cost of one's soul. But of course, the underlying ideas in conflict beneath all these examples is the archetypical story narrative of good versus evil. This is the quintessential dialectical conflict in our storytelling. Oftentimes, in a war story, the ideas represented by the protagonist are framed in what the author considers to be good, and the ideas presented by the antagonist are what the author considers to be evil. Now, I'm not saying that every story is about the conflict of good and evil, or even that every war story is about that. Dune by Frank Herbert, for instance, isn't exactly good versus evil. But what I am saying is that this is the most appealing and satisfying story to the human psyche, which is why these are the most foundational and typical types of stories, especially since it's so analogous to what every one of us goes through in our minds. We all struggle with negative impulses and destructive desires conflicting with our positive and constructive thoughts and ideas. The struggle of the human conscience. The famous image of Saint Michael defeating Satan in battle with a spear is an apt metaphor because angels and demons are purely spiritual beings with no body. They are pure intellect, so the fight between them is more akin to an intellectual face-off of 2 opposite ideas running its logical course in an argument where the truth triumphs over the false. This is why nations always try framing their wars in good and evil, because it's what makes the most sense to the fabric of the human mind. It's right versus wrong, true versus false. It's how the laws of thought forces us to think. But of course, most wars don't fit in that simple logic. Please keep in mind that in this segment of the video essay, I'm describing the narratives and logic that lead humans to war. I was not describing the nature of war itself and saying that every war is a fight between good and evil, but what I was saying is that every war needs to paint itself that way in order to make sense in the minds of people who fight it. When it fails to do so, that's when soldiers get psychologically crushed by the guilt born from their experiences in war. But we've talked enough about that. Let's leave the abstract and discuss the nature of war as a concrete historical phenomenon that ruins countless lives and why it should be avoided as much as possible. Analyzing the nature of war is to realize that war is part of nature. Because violence is a part of nature. It's how animals and even some plants feed themselves. And war is just group violence. If animals kill other species as resources to survive, then naturally there would be scenarios where they kill their own species for access to those resources. The greatest lie I've heard growing up was that of all the animals on Earth, only humans kill their own species. This used to be one of those commonly repeated false factoids you heard everywhere. But such naivete has been completely obliterated by scientific evidence, as we've observed animals of all kinds tearing their own kinds apart. I define war as simply lethal aggression between groups. Therefore, animal species capable of forming large groups often do go to war with each other. Chimpanzees and virtually all species of ants come to mind. War, being natural, therefore seems undeniable, even if many academics try denying that fact. The most famous one alive today being the anthropologist Douglas P. Fry, who argues that war is a recent phenomenon in human history and the result of hierarchical social systems, not something naturally arising from our condition. This line of thought often assumes that hunter-gatherer societies lived in more peaceful, egalitarian, and prosperous conditions of shared resources, completely ignoring the implications of the hunter aspect of hunter-gatherer, which indicates a lifestyle accustomed to violence and ending life of other beings for survival. While the academics who say war is natural point out how the ability to be aggressive is often an evolutionary advantage where the animal who is more aggressive is more likely to pass on his genes. We see this across the animal kingdom. It's why bears slap each other around in springtime for dibs on the female. By the way, mankind was not prosperous before the agricultural revolution, as a lot of hunter-gatherer, noble savage fetishists might think. Otherwise, there would be no reason to start farming in the first place. It's funny how even to this day, the two main perspectives on war in academia that influences philosophers, political scientists, and even anthropologists hasn't changed since the original disagreement between Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Often this is for political reasons. Left-wing political theories tend to blame society and inequality for war, and right-wing political theories tend to assume it's natural. Leftists worry that believing war to be natural makes us fatalistic and unable to reduce or stop the curse of war. But that's not something to worry about. You know what's also natural? Walking around naked, eating uncooked raw food, etc. And we manage to reduce those things pretty well. Except for sushi. I love me some sushi. While mathematics, literacy, medical science, etc. are decidedly unnatural, human beings are perfectly capable of ascending beyond nature. Maybe not completely, but at least to an extent. Don't get me wrong, I do think there will always be war, as long as humans are humans, but most wars can and should be avoided. I think the famous view of the renowned Prussian military leader, von Clausewitz, where he defines war as the continuation of politics by other means, is wrong, because it's the least effective way to pursue politics, since you can quickly lose control of the chaos and your entire country, and or political class if you lose the war. It's an extremely risky gamble, especially in modern warfare. Just ask his German descendants. War can put you at an existential risk, therefore starting it should be done with extreme caution. Therefore, seeing war as just business as usual in sophisticated realpolitik is bullshit, and precisely one of the things that kept putting the Germans in trouble. When war happens, it's actually because something has gone wrong. Very wrong. Something that should not have happened. Which is why, for me, my view is that war is the manifestation of sin and can be avoided through virtue. Virtue in the people and the leadership class of both sides. It's things like fear, ignorance, hatred, greed, vanity, desperation, etc. that cause war. Just because animals engage in war, it doesn't mean it's not a sin. Animals are dumb, ignorant, irrational little things constantly committing atrocities and must be lorded over by mankind who are stewards of the earth. And even animals are capable of learning how to avoid war. Ants have been discovered to sometimes form super colonies where queens from different genetic lineages learn to cooperate as one massive colony instead of fighting each other. They learned that this way they survived better than by constantly killing each other's spawn. So what's our excuse as humans? Those super ant colonies are typically invasive species that are bad for the environment, but that's another issue. Anyway, what is sin? Sin is weakness and error in character, thought, and action. War is the result of ignorance, which is weakness, but that doesn't mean that the warrior himself is weak and ignorant. The warrior can be a noble and virtuous figure because he is necessary, and he is necessary because war is inevitable. since no matter how virtuous you and your people are, the other group might not be so kind and pick a fight regardless, and you'll have to defend yourself. Virtue must be present on both sides for war to be avoided, not just one. The idea that it takes two to tango is a lie. It's absolutely possible for someone to wage a war on you and destroy your homeland even if you refuse to fight back, and it's only by fighting back that you limit the disaster of the aggressor's sin and limit the damage that he's capable of. Violence should be an absolute last resort, but it is still a resort, and that has to be taken on occasion. It's why St. Augustine developed just a war theory, so that we may recognize when the occasion arises. And even though war is horrific, it is sometimes necessary because peace is not the highest good. Life is the highest good. And sometimes choosing to be peaceful against a warring enemy causes more death than stopping the enemy by going to war when in just cause. Like it says in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a time for peace and a time for war. That's why the saints of the early church seem more peace-loving than the medieval saints who seem more militaristic, and why modern saints are more peace-loving again. Because the appropriate action changes according to what time you're living in. Which is why I think in the near future the church will emphasize the warrior vocation once more as the era shifts between the time for peace into war. When Christ said, "He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword," that wasn't a condemnation of living by the sword, because Christ himself died by the sword, because he lived by the sword of the word of God. "I shall not bring peace but a sword," is what he said. Which is why I think that the virtuous warrior is a sacrificial figure, because he is the man who willingly faces the hell of war to face death so that others don't have to. They say the soldier is expendable. Well, that's what it means. Which is why the way of the warrior is one of the many paths to imitate Christ. It's a vocation and life calling some people have. Like how some people are called to be a doctor or have affinity for being a teacher. It's a genuine way to achieve holiness. It's why military orders of warrior monks existed in church history. And why saints like Bernard de Clairvaux wrote about the new knighthood, where he elaborates on how knighthood can be holy. It's why so many protagonists of war stories are Christ figures. From Harry Potter to Gandalf to Jon Snow to Superman, etc. The noble hero who sacrifices himself and then comes back to life, because the virtuous warrior is defined by facing death for others. It's why the resurrection is a clear part of the hero's journey. Stories are personal and character-driven, so the war is often attached to the vice and sins of the characters, unlike an academic analysis where war is often seen as the result of impersonal historical forces or economic trends. Stories often are a way to remind ourselves of how the human character affects human destiny. It's kind of what I tried exploring in my webtoons called the Fractal Fables that you can read for free, link in the description. Thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.